All right, welcome back, everyone. So, some interesting stories to go into. First of all, remember how this teachers union, this teachers association, sorry, asked the Biden administration to go and target parents on counterterrorism? They said charges including maybe counterterrorism. Snopes, some of these fact checker websites went and checked it, and they're claiming that he really wasn't going after them for counterterrorism. They only suggested that maybe it would constitute that. Well, folks, a whistleblower is now saying the Department of Justice did, in fact, and may still be, in fact, using counterterrorism tools against these parents and maybe more parents as well. In other words, this whistleblower is real, and this has been widely reported now. It seems like it's real. If this whistleblower is real, then not only did they, in fact, target parents using counterterrorism investigations, but folks, it also means that some of the key people who are testifying on this, at least one of them, may have lied under oath, which is actually pretty significant. I'll be talking about this tonight. Also, a few other big stories. The Pentagon is now challenging whether states have control over the National Guard, whether, for example, different places like in Oklahoma, the commanding officer or different officials there can, cancel the vaccine mandate, which raises questions of, how high up is this vaccine mandate coming? And also, how high up are the orders if, for example, people apply for religious exemption to deny such orders, to deny such exemptions? I'll be talking about this, a few other stories. Also, something big to talk about. Judicial Watch has some new documents. And interestingly, these documents show evidence around the shooting of Ashli Babbitt. Those who remember, Ashli Babbitt was the woman who was shot and killed on January 6th by one of I think he was a Capitol police officer or security guard. The video evidence, the audio evidence, and the other forms of evidence that have been obtained by Judicial Watch, they say, shows that her shooting was unjustified, that it was an unjust shooting, that whoever shot her did so in a way that was not necessary. Folks, we'll be talking about these, a lot of other stories tonight, so stick around. And that said, it's great seeing you all here. Yeah. Hey, Florida girl, good seeing you. Yeah. Lisa Bast, he said, Lauren Ingram is talking about that now with Jim Jordan. Oh, interesting. Yeah, Shannon Haney, you said Michael Bird. That's right. That was the individual who shot her, was a Michael Bird. Yeah, Florida girl. You said it wasn't necessary. I have to agree. 111 Robin, what are you drinking tonight, Josh? I am drinking Taiwanese mountain tea tonight. All right, folks, a lot to go into. Let's get started with the first story. As always, around the halfway point, we're going to questions. So if you do have questions, leave them in the chat. First, I want to talk about what this whistleblower is saying when it comes to the Department of Justice using counterterrorism tools against parents. Now, it says here, FBI whistleblower claims DOJ, Department of Justice, used counterterrorism tools against parents. And it says this, an unnamed whistleblower disclosed documents suggesting that the FBI is using its counterterrorism resources to investigate parents or individuals who threaten school board members, teachers, or other staff, according to a letter sent by the House Judiciary GOP dated Tuesday. Briefly on this as well, head of DOJ was asked to speak on this. A lot of different people were asked to speak on this. It seems that they never independently verified the claims from this teachers association on whether there were actually threats. There were no police reports filed, pretty much nothing, meaning that they launched a counterterrorism investigation on parents using no evidence other than the allegations of this teachers association. And parents, notably, who are being accused of counterterrorism simply for things like a father getting mad because his daughter was raped in a bathroom, which is one of the big stories around this, simply because parents were opposing critical race theory and criticizing the people trying to push it on the school boards, and because they might have opposed things like vaccine mandates or mask mandates. That was something used as the grounds to have them investigated under using counterterrorism tools, according to this whistleblower. Now, it says here, the GOP letter, that's Republican Party, letter included copies of the documents allegedly sourced from the FBI whistleblower that included an email sent by Carlton L. Peoples, who served at the Bureau's Inspection Division, saying that the Counterterrorism and Criminal Division quote, created a threat tag, which was EDU officials to track instances of related threats. Now, in their letter on Tuesday, this is further into the story. In their letter on Tuesday, the Judiciary Republicans said that Attorney General Merrick Garland testified in front of a House panel and that the FBI and Department of Justice were not, this is what he claimed while he was testifying before Congress. Merrick Garland, again, the Attorney General, testifying before Congress, meaning he was under oath, I believe, and I'm pretty sure they made him swear under oath, testified in front of a House panel that the FBI and Department of Justice were not using counterterrorism resources to target threats against school board members. However, the newly unveiled documents, they argued, disproves Garland's comments, meaning he may have lied before Congress. Meaning, does that constitute contempt, like what Steve Bannon is being charged with right now? We'll see, folks. Now, I won't go over the whole story, but further in it says this. According to House Judiciary Republicans, the whistleblower's disclosure is evidence that federal law enforcement used counterterrorism resources at the behest of a, quote, left-wing special interest group to go after parents, referring to a letter that had been sent by the National School Board Association. That was the organization that sent the request to the Biden administration to have people investigated, to have parents investigated. The National School Board Association several weeks ago linking parents who are concerned about school curriculum to domestic terrorism. And again, folks, these are parents who might have been concerned about things such as critical race theory and maybe didn't agree with critical race theory being taught in the schools, which is a Marxist ideology. Ironically, Marxism, which preaches the forceful and violent overthrow of all existing institutions, including government, really an insurrectionist type worldview, and one that also teaches violence between classes applied to races in this case, ironically promoting racism. Parents who oppose, ironically, the very thing they're being accused of are the ones being targeted under this, it seems, according to this whistleblower. Now, a bit further in, it says this. It further said that the FBI and federal agents should use the Patriot Act. This is what they're saying, that the FBI and federal agencies should use the Patriot Act. That was the one under the Bush administration meant to target, terrorists during, after the World Trade Center bombing and so on. They wanted to use the Patriot Act, recommended to go after parents. Now, during the House Judiciary Committee hearing, Garland denied allegations that his agency would label concerned parents as domestic terrorists. But, folks, he told lawmakers on October 21st this: Justice Department supports and defends the First Amendment rights of parents to complain as vociferously as they wish about the education of their children, about the curriculum taught in schools. And Garland also suggested that Republicans were mischaracterizing his memorandum, saying it only pertains to threats of violence aimed at school employees and teachers, which notably the Justice Department later acknowledged they never had evidence of threats of violence, that the only evidence they had were the claims, the unfounded claims, from the National School Board Association, which made those claims without providing evidence, 0 instances, for example, of alerting police, and these types of things. Used to, again, target parents using things, including, they wanted to, the Patriot Act, again, meant to target terrorists, and even using specific threat indicators, in this case, the threat tag, they said, EDU officials to track instances where parents, they believed, may be acting in terroristic manners. Terroristic in terms of this new definition of the word. Wild times, folks. Now, we'll talk about what's happening with Ashli Babbitt and the new evidence from Judicial Watch and also some other stories. First, though, folks, I should mention we are still demonetized by YouTube. Luckily, though, we do have sponsors, and tonight's episode is brought to you by Secure. Over 155 million Americans were affected by data leaks in 2020. The average American had their personal data stolen about 4 times over the year. People get anxious because they can't protect their online data and activity. But now there's a new email and messenger app called Secure. That's Secur. That can give privacy and security for sending emails and messages. Secure's server and data center are hosted in Switzerland. That's important because Switzerland has the strictest data privacy laws in the world. Secure is also the only private and secure messaging and email app that does not rely on big tech companies like Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, which means it's also not subject to the Intrusive Cloud Act. Secure also does not ask for your phone number, does not mine your data, and does not upload your contacts like all the other applications of this type tend to do. Something becoming increasingly important if you want to have real conversations online. Now, folks, it functions by adding people you know and then adding their secure number. You can also still chat with non-secure users by adding them through an invite. In this way, you're protected from hackers getting onto your phone and you have full privacy while on the app. Now, it's $5 for the messenger and only $10 for the email and messenger package. You can visit secure.com today for a free 7-day trial or use the promo code Joshua to get 25% off. And folks, again, big thanks out to Secure for sponsoring tonight's episode. Now, briefly, I want to talk a bit more about what's happening with this Department of Justice finding. Now, keep in mind, this is according to a Republican report. The Republicans apparently have this whistleblower who stepped forward, and this was included in a GOP letter. So take it for what it's worth. There is a certain political dimension to it. But political or not, partisan or not, the issue is whether the evidence holds up. If this whistleblower is claiming, and we'll see if it can be verified, that in fact the Department of Justice did in fact mobilize its counterterrorism resources to target parents on no evidence. Remember, they said this. If they were using counterterrorism tools to go after parents with no evidence from law enforcement, no evidence of threats being made, nothing, then what was the basis of them using those types of resources on something that was very obviously politically motivated, which was, again, parents opposing things like mask mandates, opposing things like critical race theory, being unhappy about what's being taught to their kids, which is, of course, a very politicized education system, critical race theory. And also, there was one father who, of course, was angry, and he seems to be the only one who got it to hand because his daughter was raped in a bathroom. Remember that, folks. And so this was the basis of the evidence, this letter from, again, from this, National School Board Association, that the claims of an organization, a very politicized leftist organization, that the single claims from them requesting that the Biden administration mobilize counterterrorism resources against people it disagrees with politically, it happened. If this whistleblower is telling the truth, and frankly, we'll see whether it's true, but this seems to be the case. Now, we'll see what this means as well, especially if the Patriot Act was used in this regard, and also, what types of information they were or may have been gathering on parents, or if we can even find that information. Keep in mind, folks, that things may turn around quite a bit pretty soon if Republicans regain control, at least of the House. Which is they could start their own House committees, like this January 6th committee, which the Democrats are, of course, running right now. The tides could really change very quickly. And so I would assume the Democrats in this regard, the Democratic Party, we need to be a little more careful when doing things like this because it could really backfire on them. We'll see how it goes, though. Now, speaking of the January 6th committee and the things that do warrant actual investigation, folks, Judicial Watch now has evidence suggesting that the killing of Ashli Babbitt on January 6th was unjustified. Now, keep in mind, you can take it for what it's worth. There were protests. People illegally entered the building, even though some of them were waved into the building by police there. Some claim they were shoved into the building as they were getting too close. Keep in mind, there have been Democrats who've done similar things during protests, not, for example, the Capitol building, well, not recently at least, but in other instances, Weather Underground, for example, people, exonerated of their crimes, for example. Well, folks, one of those people who was shot and killed, well, the only person who was shot and killed that day was Ashli Babbitt. And it was not a protester against security forces or whatever. This was the apparently unjustified shooting of one of the protesters. Now, if the tables had been turned, well, the situation would be very different. If, for example, this was a BLM protest and an officer shot one of the protesters with no grounds for doing so, as the allegations are now coming out that there was no grounds to shoot Ashli Babbitt, imagine what the reaction would be. Now, if you want to understand whether there's a double standard with these things, just switch the circumstances, switch the parties, and imagine what the reaction would be, or look at how the reaction typically is. Frankly, folks, there seems to be a serious double standard on this because not only was this officer not charged, this officer was awarded. Now, let me detail what happened because, again, Judicial Watch has some documents on it now, documents, videos, audio, a lot of evidence they're claiming. And it says here, Judicial Watch has received first-hand evidence from the DC Metropolitan Police Department that the shooting death of Ashli Babbitt was, quote, unjustified. The conservative activist group announced on November 10th. Now, it says the organization said in a statement that it has received new audio, video footage, and photo records pertaining to the shooting death of Ashli Babbitt, including a cell phone video of the shooting itself, as well as a short police interview of the shooter. This is U.S. Capitol Police Officer Lieutenant Michael Byrd. Remember that name, folks, because we'll see if he actually gets charged for this, if it wasn't unjustified. Remember, folks, with the killing of George Floyd, how many officers are standing trial for what they say was murder, right? Is it 4 officers, 5 officers? Now, if the shooting death of Ashli Babbitt was also unjustified, if it was unjust use of force, and remember all the different politicians who pushed for the, even like the lynching basically of the officer who killed George Floyd, well, these same politicians come out and condemn this officer and want justice against this officer who shot and killed Ashli Babbitt. If the evidence does, in fact, as Judicial Watch is claiming, show that it was an unnecessary murder. Well, folks, we'll see about this. Now, it says here, Babbitt, who was 35 years old, was among the crowd that breached the Capitol on January 6, interrupting a joint session of Congress convened to certify the presidential election's electoral votes. As she attempted to climb through the broken window into the speaker's lobby adjacent to the House chamber, she was shot by Byrd. Now, folks, I won't go over the whole story because there's a lot to go into. If you want to watch an interesting take on it, because shortly after this incident, of course, I was reporting on January 6th while all this was unfolding. I did a great interview with a Japanese journalist named Masako Ganaha, which you can still find on Crossroads. You can still find on our YouTube channel and on Epic Times, where actually she analyzed the shooting death of Ashli Babbitt and also some of the strange behavior both of the officers and of other individuals who were nearby. It's a very interesting interview observing some of the video evidence that was there. And even based on our own observation, it seemed that not only was her death very likely unjustified, but also it seemed to be there was some strange coordination taking place among several individuals who were present. Now, I won't go over all that here, but continue on the story. It says here, Judicial Watch obtained the material, these photos, videos, audio recordings, including the interview with Byrd himself, claimed the material through a May 2021 Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, FOIA lawsuit, meaning where people like you and I or media organizations can request different government agencies or branches provide you with documents based on freedom of information. That under this act, of course, they have to give you information if you request it, typically, if it's not like, something they legally can't show you. Now, records include a new cell phone video, which has been edited, interestingly, by the DC police and shows officers reacting to the shooting. The footage, which is 1.27 minutes long, depicts a chaotic scene as dozens of officers walk up a stairwell, as we've discussed previously on the show. Dozens of officers walk up a stairwell and approach a group of protesters inside the building before attempting to pull some of them away. The faces of those in the video have been blurred out, however. Their voices can be heard. The documents also include photos of the area where Babbitt died, which show broken glass and chairs piled up in the speaker's lobby. There are also DC police photographs of Byrd, his hands, and his gun, as well as pictures of a folding knife, which was allegedly found in Babbitt's pocket. There's also a 16-minute, 40-second audio recording of police interviewing Byrd on the day of the incident. The voices in that interview and others have been digitally altered to try to hide the identities of those involved. Now, I won't go over the entire story, but at the bottom it says this. These recordings and photos provide dramatic first-hand evidence that the shooting death of Ashli Babbitt was unjustified, said Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton. And he continued stating, "It is disturbing that neither the Pelosi Congress nor the Biden/Garland DOJ took no action over this needless death." Now, folks, again, Ashli Babbitt was shot and killed. There seems to be no real investigation into her death other than lawsuits from the family. Typically, of course, officers have some degree of protection, but typically if they kill someone, they can still be charged. We'll see if this officer, Officer Byrd, is charged, much in the way that the officer who killed George Floyd was charged and then found guilty. Folks, I would say that in terms of details, this is very similar. The difference being that, of course, this was an officer who shot a woman in the neck and she was trying to climb through a window, and under circumstances that evidence now suggests may have been unjustified. The question now is whether he will be charged or whether Democrats will continue to give this officer awards, as they have been doing. A very strange shift in terms of the narrative, and we'll see how this goes now that evidence is emerging on what actually took place. Evidence we've discussed, some of which on the show previously. Now, that being said, we were talking, of course, about this January 6th House Commission, the one that is now trying to is charging Steve Bannon, a former Trump aide, Steve Bannon. He does War Room Pandemic, the show, charging him with contempt of Congress because he refused to appear when they subpoenaed him. This organization, technically a very partisan investigation committee, because everybody on it voted to impeach Trump based on the belief and their personal belief that what Trump did on January 6th, where he told people to protest peacefully and then to leave, that what Trump did constituted, calling for essentially insurrection, and based on that, he should be impeached. Everybody on that commission voted against Trump, meaning that even though there are 2 Republicans, I believe, they, of course, sided with the Democrats on the vote, meaning it's actually a very partisan committee. Now, I won't detail some of the information on, what we talked about in the last episode. You can watch the last episode if you want to hear some of my take on that. But folks, one of the big questions is, will this investigative committee actually investigate the full spectrum of issues that did take place on January 6th? One of them, of course, being the shooting death of Ashli Babbitt, which evidence now suggests was unjustified. The other thing that should be investigated, in my personal opinion, are the many, many protesters who've been held under very terrible circumstances in gulag-like conditions ever since. And I want to detail to you now some of what they're living under, because there were some reports on this, and I've been wanting to talk to you about this for a while now. Folks, there's a court filing that says January 6 defendants, these people who have been held in these conditions, were taken out of their cells on stretchers, meaning they probably couldn't even walk. And let me tell you now, because the court documents are detailing some of the conditions they've been living under. If anything really necessitates investigation, I'd say this seriously necessitates investigation. It says here, multiple January 6 defendants were taken out of their cells on stretchers Thursday. This is, I believe, a week ago, according to a court filing. These situations started when one of the defendants refused to wear a mask. Family members and they're being told they have to wear masks, I believe, according to reports, 24/7 while in their cells. Now, it says here on this is according to family members of Kelly Meggs, who is being held in the D.C. jail. Now, this is according to Meggs' lawyer. One sec. Now, folks, get this. Individuals being held in solitary confinement. It says here, prison guards began spraying a chemical substance described as, quote, some kind of mace or pepper spray, according to a filing in federal court. They, quote, sprayed mace or some type of gas at an inmate and kept missing, so it went into an intake that fed into other cells, and the lady with the key left because she didn't like the gas. The officer who had the key to these cells, it's according to this, left because she didn't like the gas. In other words, folks, imagine you're in a little cell and you're, there under conditions where you've been held, since January 6th, and you're being held under solitary confinement, and you're in a small cell, and suddenly mace or some kind of pepper spray, something that is coming through the oxygen intake into your cell. This is like, gas chamber type stuff. happening to these people. You can only imagine what would happen. Now, typically mace or pepper spray won't kill you, but if you're in an environment where there's no other oxygen, or even if your oxygen intake is then, basically fumigating you in your cell, yes, it might kill you. And folks, people who are exposed to this had to be taken out on stretchers. And then what happens when the officers realize this is happening? The person with the key leaves the scene because they don't like it, because they don't like the smell. They don't like the being exposed to this, the things that these inmates are being gassed with. And so because of this, the inmates, it says, in the cells who are being fed the gas from that intake were locked in for like 15 minutes. This is a quote. We're locked in for like 15 minutes while I was going into the rooms, and they couldn't see or breathe. Now, folks, the family told this to Jonathan Mosley, the lawyer. Now, more than one of the defendants was taken out on stretchers to medical bays. Julie Kelly, a writer for the American Greatness, reported on Wednesday that prison, and this is, I believe, a week ago, and prison guards filled an area of the jail with chemical spray, and 3 detainees had to be taken out on stretchers, according to her report. Mosley said that the D.C. Department of Corrections did not respond for requests for comment. The lawyer said his client was not in one of the cells that the gas was cycled into by the ventilation system. He urged the court to explore with the Bureau of Prisons and Congress whether any federal funds are already or can be allocated to repair and upgrade the D.C. jail facilities. Neither prosecutors nor the judge has yet to respond to the filing. Now, briefly on this, folks, one very important thing to keep in mind is that based on current election statistics, whether it's redistricting, whether it's even just projections on where things are heading, even according to Democrat strategists, Republicans look like they're going to retake the House. There's a very strong chance of it. Now, what 2 precedents have been established by the Democrats? They've established a precedent, one, of establishing an organization to investigate January 6th on partisan grounds, even including denying access of the 2 Republicans who were proposed by the Republican Party, instead choosing 2 of them who they, it seems to be the case, believed would side with them on their moves to investigate things, meaning that the Democrats overrode the Republicans on having what would have constituted, by the Republicans' standards, really a bipartisan commission. In other words, Republicans, once they, according to redistricting and the trajectory we're on, once Republicans take control of the House, folks, they could create their own commission to investigate January 6th. And frankly, things like this do constitute a reason to investigate. What else have Republicans gotten? Well, the other big precedent the Democrats have now established is charging people with contempt if they refuse to appear when they're subpoenaed, when they refuse to appear when they're asked by these different commissions to go and appear. They did this to Steve Bannon, meaning, folks, that if, for example, Republicans come into the House, which they're projected to do, based on pretty much every element of trajectory and redistricting, and even, again, Democrat strategists, not only could they create their own commission to investigate January 6th and look into things like this, look into, for example, who canceled Trump's offer to provide, for example, National Guard support at the Capitol building on that day, who, for example, was in charge of deleting Trump's tweets, calling on people to protest peacefully and then to go home, and then banned him from Twitter. Well, Twitter, for example, answered to that decision. And folks, what about these officers treating people in this way at this jail? Will they be subpoenaed? Will they be asked to appear before court? And frankly, if they refuse to, will they also be charged with contempt like Steve Bannon is now? This is the precedent that has now been established, and a precedent which, frankly, is going to, again, act very strongly, I believe, against the Democrats if they don't do something to change what they're doing. Things could change very quickly, and frankly, it's on the trajectory to change very quickly unless, some change takes place politically somehow. Let me finish up what's happening here with this story, and then we'll go into some more questions. We'll go into some questions. Now, as it says here, that Avis Buchanan, director of the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., said in a statement it has called out the treatment of detainees at the D.C. jail for years. Now, Buchanan said this: The inhumane conditions. This is at this prison where the jail where, again, the January 6th people are facing this, right? It says the inhumane conditions have included long-term solitary confinement for people with no disciplinary issues, lack of running water, full illumination of cells for 24 hours per day, resulting in sleep deprivation, cells soiled with feces and blood, lack of air conditioning during the summer and heat during the winter, lack of proper medical care, failure to provide mental health treatment, and physical and mental abuse for correctional officers of people in their custody. Those are the accusations. Now, we'll see what happens with this. Because, as Chris Anderson's noting as well, he said, Josh, you're assuming Republicans will actually do something other than talk, though. It's true. We'll see how it goes with them. Alex Campbell, you're saying war crimes against humanity. It's pretty serious. Frankly, this sounds like gulag-type conditions, frankly. It doesn't seem they're killing people like gulags would have done, but it is pretty bad. This is not how we would imagine U.S. jails to be. And ironically, it's typically the Democrats who, are always up in arms about poor treatment of prisoners and people being held, without trial and so on. People being held without charges. Typically, it's Democrats who are making the noise around this. So why are the standards different here? Why are the standards different here? That's a big question to ask. But folks, like I said, we'll see how things go because the tides could turn very quickly. And frankly, the precedent that has been established both by the commission, the House Commission, currently led by the Democrats, and also of the ability to hold people for contempt of Congress for refusing to appear before this commission, frankly, that could very easily end up in the hands of Republicans very soon. We'll see how it goes. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into some questions. So if you have questions, leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. First, though, folks, I have mentioned we already monetized by YouTube, but we started our own video service. It's now almost like a Netflix type thing. We have, of course, not just different shows there. This is Epic TV. We also have some movies now. Working on getting some other ones. We have a lot of independent films, a lot of classics. We're working on getting a lot more, so stay tuned for that. We also have a lot of really good shows. One of them is Sam Sorbo's show, which is it's a show for parents who are doing homeschool, who are homeschooling their kids. And even if you're not homeschooling your kid or you just want to learn about it, it's a great show to check out. Again, thank you all, those of you who are watching on Epic TV, because we're broadcasting there as well. And folks, again, if you want to support Crossroads, a great way to do it is to tell a friend or family member about Epic TV. That's epochtv.com/Crossroads. And do the / because it helps us out. And folks, you can find the link to that in the description below. I'm going to show you a quick trailer of what Sam Sorbo has been up to on her channel.
What has been happening at the school board meetings across the nation? Parents speaking about policies and practices they consider to be detrimental to their children. The CSE seeks to expose children prematurely to sexual images and ideas because teachers in our schools graduated from the university institutions. Well, what did you expect? Especially if the teachers truly buy into the false philosophy. Why are schools today insisting on training our children that they are inherently either oppressor or oppressed, that the United States is an evil nation and that there is no fixed truth, in an effort to turn children against their heritage and make them embarrassed to have been born into the most prosperous and beneficial country ever to have existed?
All right, folks, again, that's School's Out with Sam Sorbo. You might remember Sam Sorbo. She's the wife of Kevin Sorbo, Hercules. Remember the show Hercules? She was actually on the show as well. That's where they met. She has a great show, again, called School's Out. Be sure to check it out. Link in the description below to Epic TV. Also, folks, those of you watching, we are going to have a special episode tomorrow. Now, in addition to everything else we're doing, I'm also doing these, we're trying to do monthly or even faster than that, these China webinars. We're going to have a special episode tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern time. You can watch it here. You can watch it on Epic TV, which is we're going to have some different experts. I'm going to be moderating a panel of 3 experts talking about some of these strange issues taking place behind the new Iron Curtain in China. And really digging into what the Chinese Communist Party is doing with its economy, because it seems that some very, very strange things are afoot in China, and the very strange things happening there are affecting us here economically as well. So be sure to tune in. Special episode tomorrow night, 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. All right, folks, so that's us. Jump into some questions. And again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat now. First is from Jared Riguez, 042311. He said, Josh, sir, is there any weight to Louisiana Representative Higgins' comments on restoring service members who are separated for refusing the jab? Is this within the purview of Congress? Thanks, sir. Well, we'll have to see. It seems right now that there are debates taking place over how much authority states have when it comes to decisions coming down through the Pentagon. Now, typically states, if you talk about like the state militaries of the National Guard, would technically be under the state. You have the Pentagon right now trying to say that states don't have that power. For example, in Oklahoma, that's one of the big stories. I'll be talking about it after the questions. In Oklahoma, for example, the Pentagon is saying that it has the authority to require the National Guard there to have these vaccine mandates, even though the local government is saying they do not have the authority. I think with a lot of these issues, as we've been discussing across the board almost, I think there are really big debates taking place over the length of authority that the federal government can issue, and whether states can intervene in things like this, for example, and legally, and actually have them hold. We'll see where it goes. We'll also see what it means too if people get dishonorably discharged from the military, or it seems what I've been told by some individuals looking into this, that some of the individuals who are refusing to get the vaccine are not going to be dishonorably discharged, which is pretty serious. A lot of them are going to be put on temporary hold, which means you basically just wait and time out until your time in service is essentially over and you don't get any of the benefits you might have gotten, at least for the National Guard. We'll see what happens with this, but as I mentioned, I believe that court decisions are going to have to determine whether states actually do have this authority, because it's all kind of up in the air right now. Swiss Shadows, you're saying, hi, Josh. When documents are leaked, where do you get to read them? So Epic Times is actually pretty unique in this regard, and we've had discussions on it. You might notice that a lot of news websites these days, they don't link to their sources. A lot of news websites have removed that practice. It used to be the case, remember, on the internet, that if a news agency wrote about a story, they would link to all their sources. If there were documents, if there were PDFs, if there were videos, if there were other news articles, they would link to them. A lot of them stopped doing that because if you link to them, it means people might click through and leave your website. Epic Times is one of the few news websites that continues to link its sources. And so on these stories, if you want to read the original sources, check out the articles I'm going over, and the articles will still have their sources linked. That is a practice we have maintained, again, even though a lot of media no longer do it. We believe it's necessary for people to be able to have the ability, if they choose, to check your sources. We think it's a necessary practice to have. Question here from Seymour Butts. He said, Josh, when and if Trump gets back in office, what power will he have to, 1, free the January 6 protesters, and 2, fire that coward Michael Byrd? Well, Trump would have a few different powers. He could pardon the protesters, if the ones being held, again, protesting since January 6th. But I believe he can only pardon them after they've been charged. And so we'll see if they're still being held in solitary confinement at that time without having to face trial. We'll see what happens with that. Trump could also criticize them. He could also call, he could fire the head of the Department of Justice, for example. He could fire the heads of different organizations, which he did quite a bit when he was in office. If he doesn't believe they're doing their jobs well, he can do a lot of things like that. If the people are charged or found innocent or found guilty, he could pardon them, meaning their charges are dropped. Remember, he did it with Steve Bannon and a few other individuals. Could he fire Michael Byrd? I don't think he could fire Michael Byrd. He wouldn't have the power. From what I understand, he would not have the power to fire an officer, including a House officer like that. He could put political pressure on them. He could do things like that. He could ask the Department of Justice to investigate, similar to how Biden was asked by this school board to investigate parents for counterterrorism and mobilize the Department of Justice to do so, it seems. He could do things like that. Typically, though, again, that applies to the branches of government. The judicial branch is separate from the executive branch, the executive being the president's office, of course. Judicial branch being the courts. The courts would have to go and do something like that against Michael Byrd, although Trump could encourage it if he was in office. Another question here from Steve McNasty. He said, question, we are told that the militia referred to in the Second Amendment is the National Guard in order to argue that the Second Amendment doesn't apply to individuals. Now the Pentagon wants to argue that they control the Guard. What is up with that? Yeah, it used to be the case that the National Guard was the state militia. Basically, it was a states had their own military in the U.S. You know, the United States is a very unique country because technically it's 50 different countries and then like an overarching country containing the 50 countries. You haven't had many countries like this. It's actually, interestingly, closer to the empires, such as the Roman Empire or the Chinese Empire in history, where, for example, you'd have kingdoms with their own militaries, their own king, and then you had like the king of kings who would be the emperor, like the Chinese emperor, the head of all the different provincial kings and so on. And of course, we don't have kings, we have elected officials because we're a constitutional republic, which is the main difference. But in terms of structure, it's actually very similar. Every state has its own government. Many states have their own constitutions. Many states have their own militaries, the National Guard being the military of the states. Now, through various changes in laws, the federal government has become able to essentially mobilize the National Guard, the state militaries. And they're trying to exercise power now over the National Guard from federal level executive orders, such as the vaccine mandate. It'll actually, I think, have to go to court to determine whether they have the power to do that, because it does pull into question, I think, the argument of whether states actually control the National Guard as they're supposed to. In terms of the militia, the words of the Founding Fathers can be debated as people want. Keep in mind, at the time of the Founding Fathers, the military had to be essentially mobilized and commissioned. It wasn't just like there was just a standing military at all times. The militia was like the Minutemen, right? Just guys with guns who came together and just randomly formed a military. Interestingly, I've been reading some old books on it. George Bancroft, for example, a book written in the 1860s. I have it sitting over on a desk over there. I've been reading, talking about what the American War of Independence was like. Interestingly, that Washington was writing. They didn't even have logistics. They didn't even have the ability to provide food to a lot of the American soldiers. The food was being provided by the local community. It's interesting because it's almost like free market principles applied to a military. Washington himself was observing it, and he was like, I don't even know how it's working, but it's working because people, the communities, families, and so on were just joining together to provide all the resources to people. And this grassroots action created actually a very well-functioning machine that allowed them to beat the strongest military in the world, which was, again, under the British Empire. Keep in mind, in terms of understanding what the Founding Fathers would have considered a militia, keep in mind what militias were at the time. That was your average American having a war rifle, able to mobilize against government tyranny and even overthrow a tyrannical government, which at the time, of course, they were under the British Empire. That was the context of them putting that in the Constitution. So interpret it as you will. Yeah. Anyways, it seems like people are trying to reinterpret the Constitution to get rid of rights they don't want people to have. And that's the real nature of these debates. Another question here from Daryl Watts. He said, Josh, what's the drink tonight? Oh, yeah, I mentioned earlier, it's Taiwanese mountain tea. Highly recommended if you like oolong tea or green tea. Kind of like a nice in between. It's like very light. I highly recommend it. Also, you said Justin 30 asked me to ask you, he had to get to work, but I said I would ask the question. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Questionnaire from LupGRU666. You said, Question: did you see the school meeting in Texas where a parent told the people he had 1,000 soldiers locked and loaded? I did not see that. But folks, under the American system, you can have your own militia. There's nothing that's ever been against that until very recently. Now, if you're saying that you want to try to, I don't know, launch attacks against civilian populations, that'd be a very different thing. That'd be like terroristic threats. But in terms of having a militia, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing illegal about it. It has been an American practice since the founding of this country. It's just the way things always were. They're trying to make it into something controversial these days. Frankly, I'd actually question how many people in most militias are actually not federal agents these days anyways, but we'll see. Another question here from Weldon Morgan. You said, keep in mind, a lot of this is ATF, the ATF being formed to investigate things like this, which is actually a very new organization as well. Question here from Weldon Morgan. You said, do you believe there may be a tie-in between what law enforcement is currently doing and the many retirements of Democrats, i.e.g. January 6th? Actually, I was going to include that among the segments tonight. Folks, there are a lot of Democrats who are not running for re-election. There are a lot of Democrats who are retiring. I mean, the number keeps increasing. And locally, on the community level, on the more local level too, you have a lot of Democrats who are even switching parties. I would say this is the issue of, frankly, like I said, there have been big political shifts that took place in this country. The Republican Party is no longer the Republican Party of George Bush. It's very, very different. The George Bush went to the Democrats, basically. He endorsed Biden. It's no longer that party. The Trump phenomena within the Republican Party shook everything up. He called them rhinos, the ones who are more like the old guard. A lot of those people either left office during the midterms under Trump or moved towards the Democrats or voted with the Democrats. A lot of those people are no longer around. There was a huge shift in the Republican Party. Now, even Trump, as we speak, is creating his own PAC, Political Action Committee, challenging even the RNC, the Republican National Committee. And even now, as we speak, you have two basic Republican parties, but Trump has the majority one, and Republicans realize they have to fall in behind Trump. That's the new Republican Party. A lot of them have already left office, the ones who are opposed to this whole new party, essentially, that's been founded, again, even with George Bush siding with Obama and so on. At the same time, the Democrat Party is no longer the same Democrat Party as it was, in the Bush era and so on. Remember, Bill Clinton was a tough on immigration guy. Even Biden was a tough on crime guy. Hillary Clinton was the one who talked about super predators and these things like this 3-strike rule and so on. That was the old Democrats. Things that ironically would be considered probably far right these days. Now, Democrats moved. They've moved to the very, very far left. They've moved with the squad. And that was a big question that was coming up. Remember when AOC, Cortez like the conquistador, AOC Cortez came in and, was of course promoting really outright socialism. Remember, even during the first term of Obama, socialism in America was still kind of a bad word. Democrats wouldn't even call themselves socialists. At most, they would say they're like democratic socialists, meaning they believe in achieving socialism through democratic means, i.e. voting, rather than let's say, violent overthrow of government, which typically socialism is achieved through. That being the only difference. Hitler was a democratic socialist. He was a national socialist elected through democratic means. Hitler was a democratic socialist. But of course, they call themselves democratic socialists now. The question was an AOC and the squad came in and they began shaking things up in the Democratic Party, was whether the Democrats would be able to integrate them or whether there would be a split within the party or if they'd move towards the far left with them. And folks, they moved towards the far left with them. And that is the new Democrat Party policy. The issue that's creating now is that the moderates, or people who are more not really with this, right? The more moderates ended up moving more towards the right. That's what happened. And now you're having moderates who feel they've been left behind by their own party. As the Republican Party shifts in nature, you're seeing a shifting among politicians, and it seems that this is going to be one of the big issues as we go into the midterms, because those who don't agree with it but also don't want to change parties, some of them may just retire. A whole lot of them have been announcing that they're not going to run for re-election. A whole lot of them are announcing that they're retiring. Yeah, Tyler Bozinovsky, you said Hitler's socialism was a bit different. Read Hitler's original policies. They were almost identical to Bernie Sanders. Of course, it became, we saw what it became, of course. But frankly, who's to say that with critical race theory, it won't go that same way? These days they're advocating for identity politics, just like Hitler did under Aryanism. It's the same thing, frankly. And also the creation of state enemies, blaming the problems of society on one set group, like this whole critical race theory thing is doing. They're using the same policies. They're using the same practices. It's very unfortunate to see this happen in this country. Yeah. Anyways, you can watch my episode on the dark origins of communism where I talk about this. All right, folks. That said, let's jump into some more stories for the night, because I want to talk about some updates real quick on the Pentagon and the vaccine mandates, and also just a few updates on where things are going with that. Then I want to talk a bit about the raid on Project Veritas and where that's at, because you've seen some interesting shifts with that, including the ACLU actually siding with Project Veritas. And also the New York Times getting called out because they somehow got leaked information that Project Veritas itself was also not told to publicly disclose. Some very strange things like this. And so first off, let me talk about what's happening with the Pentagon and where things are at with some of their vaccine mandates. Basically, the Pentagon is challenging states on whether it has more authority over the National Guard than they do. And again, this goes into some of what we were just discussing and why that matters. It says here, Pentagon says it has authority to require Oklahoma National Guard to follow vaccine mandate. It says the Pentagon on Monday said it has the authority to require members of the National Guard to get vaccinated against COVID-19 after the Oklahoma National Guard's newly appointed commander refused to impose a vaccine mandate ordered by the Defense Department. The Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby told reporters that U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, quote, has the authority he needs to require this vaccine across the force, including the National Guard. Now, Kirby later added during a news briefing that it is a, quote, lawful order for the National Guardsmen to receive the COVID vaccine. And it's important he said lawful order, which is because he's very likely trying to clarify something that, frankly, that people who are in the armed services in America are sworn to do, which is uphold the Constitution, protected against enemies, both foreign and domestic, and also that they have the ability to refuse unlawful orders. So they have to clarify that they believe this is a lawful order, even if officers believe it is not a lawful order, something that they would have the actual right to refuse. We'll see how this goes, folks, because again, this will probably be challenged, and we'll see what direction it goes in, because this will determine also whether people in the armed service can interpret the Constitution and what is constitutional and what is not, and also what is lawful and what is not based on written law. We'll see. Now, briefly, I want to talk about a few headlines, just real brief, going over what's happening with lawsuits against the Biden mandates as they move forward, because I always like to talk about with the vaccines, and a lot I want to cover, but there's just not time sometimes. A few things, though. A conservative majority court is going to decide on Biden's private employer vaccine mandate. This is important, folks, because remember we talked about this appeals court blocking Biden's vaccine mandate, the one that makes businesses with over 100 or more employees have to either have people get vaccinated or have regular testing. That's going to court. That's going to trial. There was a lottery up on which court would get to hold that trial. The one that got the trial is one that has more conservatives than Democrats on it, meaning that it's going to be more of a Republican-ish, or conservative, I should say, leaning judges on it, meaning that Republicans tend to be more against these types of policies, meaning that it may actually get overturned. Now, ultimately, it will probably still go to the Supreme Court. So just keeping in mind that you're going to hear victories and setbacks and so on like that all over the place. Until it goes to the Supreme Court, we're not going to hear anything final on it, very likely, but we'll see. Also, 13 states are now suing to block Biden's vaccine mandate for healthcare workers. Also, an Oklahoma bill will allow employees to sue for $1 million over vaccine mandates, which is pretty significant, especially given, again, that, and this is interesting, this is actually where it is significant on a court blocking the Biden mandates, is that now that a court has blocked them, it means individual businesses can decide whether to carry it out, again, ignoring the orders from the court. And if you get fired or let go or whatever else because of these vaccine mandates, or if your business tries to enforce something, which again, a appeals court has blocked, in Oklahoma now they're saying that you can sue your business for $1 million. And we'll see whether that spreads as well. Again, it's just a bill, but we'll see where it goes. Also, some brief updates on the mandates. In New York City, they said they're going to be, this is according to de Blasio, our Sandinista mayor. It says New York City to focus, quote, more intensely on vaccination of children. And also 62,000 doses have been administered so far. Also in Orange County, you have similar policies requiring vaccination of kids. And parents and students are now holding a sit and rally against these vaccine mandates. Kids are next in line. Again, you have schools that receive federal government funding, meaning they can implement these to an extent. And even on city levels, you have some of these issues as well. New York City previously mandated vaccinations for kids in the public school system, targeting actually Jewish communities because they were saying that Jewish communities weren't vaccinating their kids. De Blasio had a lot of problems with the Jewish community because of it. But they did make it in New York where parents could not even opt out of it, whereas you previously could. And so, in other words, what has happened in New York is spreading to other parts of the U.S., and they're trying to push this now on kids who are in the public school system. Also, folks, a quick update in Austria. Now, folks, Austria is kind of representing the direction that the Western world may soon head in, which is a direction the Chinese Communist Party, I think, even hasn't fully gone down, which is they're making it so they're bringing back the lockdowns. Remember last year, we were all locked in our homes, this 2 weeks to slow the spread. Remember that? Folks, they're doing that again, but they're only doing the lockdowns for people who have not gotten the vaccine. And it's interesting because in Austria, they had some of the lowest numbers of people wanting to get vaccinated. This appears to be their solution. You have to stay in your home. You're on timeout until you get the vaccine. Now, 15,000 people were checked by police during the first day of the lockdown. So it seems police are enforcing it, 15,000 people. But we'll see where this goes, folks, because frankly, it's starting to look a whole lot like apartheid. It's starting to look a whole lot like we've created two separate classes of people. And some have freedom and some do not. It's much like George Orwell in his book, Animal Farm, that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Remember, folks. Anyways, a lot to go into tonight, and I know we're almost out of time, but I want to talk very briefly about what's happening with Project Veritas. First off, folks, remember the Project Veritas was raided by federal agents. The raid took place, or was carried out, allegedly, because, again, Project Veritas had received a journal, apparently or a diary, whatever we call it, belonging to the daughter of Joe Biden. Now, they claimed that they were not able to, this is according to James O'Keefe in a video, they claimed that they were not able to verify whether it was real or not. And because they weren't able to verify it, they tried returning it. First, they went to the Biden family and tried to provide it to their lawyer. The lawyer would not accept it, according to Project Veritas. After they tried returning it to the family, they then tried giving it to law enforcement, and they claimed law enforcement also would not accept it. So after they received this diary that they believed they could not verify whether it was real or not, they tried returning it twice, both to the family and to law enforcement, were refused. And then what happens? Federal agents raid the homes, or raid several of their employees, and even raid the home of James O'Keefe. A very strange development, because, again, they're being accused of having stolen the diary of Joe Biden, or Joe Biden's daughter. Now, it's interesting to see where this is going because, frankly, folks, the idea that the federal government would raid the homes of journalists for obtaining, evidence or documents. You can even think, for example, the hard drive for Hillary Clinton's emails, things that a lot of journalists had in previous incidents, and even Democrats getting a lot of leaked documents. And for example, Trump's tax returns and so on, things allegedly leaked to journalists that they obtained through means that may not have been legal. The question is whether journalists can still do that and not get raided by federal agents and face serious charges. And this is one of the big issues that a lot of these typically more leftist leaning organizations are having to face with. Do they side with Project Veritas on this, or do they just oppose them because they politically disagree with them? It's interesting to see that some journalist organizations and even the ACLU are now siding with Project Veritas on this. Organizations you wouldn't normally expect to see siding with Project Veritas. It says here briefly, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, has publicly criticized the FBI's raid on Project Veritas founder James O'Keefe in a statement that also denounces the media outlet for allegedly deceptive journalism. So they maintain their criticisms of Project Veritas, while also, again, condemning what the FBI did to Project Veritas. And briefly on this as well, there's a former prosecutor saying that the New York Times, having gotten information on the raid, on things that even James O'Keefe at Project Veritas was told that he should not make public, that somehow someone alerted New York Times to the point where they called Project Veritas really as this thing was just wrapping up. Meaning, very likely someone gave New York Times information on this, and this former prosecutor is now saying that the FBI should be investigated on that. Anyways, folks, a lot to go into. Also, briefly, Steve Bannon, again, a former Trump aide, has now surrendered to the FBI. He's being charged with contempt of Congress because he refused to go in front of this January 6th commission after they asked him to reveal information that, frankly, he may not even be legally allowed to provide to them. There's a lot of strange stuff going on, folks. Now, Bannon seems to believe that he can actually win a major legal battle with this, and he views it as a fight, and he's that kind of character. He's a fighter. We'll see where it goes. Anyways, folks, a lot going on. Too much to go into in a single night, an hour for that matter. But of course, I'll keep you updated as big news comes out. And again, I do these live Q&As every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. So we'll call it a night tonight, folks. That said, I'm going to be traveling again. So I'll be on the road again, I think, next episode. But folks, again, please tune in next episode. That'll be this coming Thursday at 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And be sure also to tune in tomorrow night. We have a special episode that's going to be our China webinar, where I'm going to be moderating a panel talking about what's happening with the economy, this economic crisis, and what China is actually doing behind the scenes with it. All right, folks. Looking at, just briefly wrapping this up, looking at this whole trajectory here, it seems to be the case that, again, whether it's what's happening to Steve Bannon, what just happened to Project Veritas, the investigations of the January 6th Commission, and the shooting of Ashli Babbitt, evidence now emerging on this, the treatment of the January 6th protesters, a lot of the trajectories we're watching, these would normally be issues that Democrats and especially Democrat voters would be opposed to. Now you see the parties having shifted so far to an extreme that you have to wonder whether people move along with them on this. This is where political shifts begin to take place. And we'll see how it works, especially if people believe that things have been so wild that they believe that legitimate investigations may be necessary into some of these issues, which can actually change things quite a bit. Also, as a lot of things move forward through the court system, and you're going to hear a lot of noise, you're going to hear a lot of chaos, you're going to hear all kinds of things on what is legal and not legal and based on court opinions, folks. Until it goes to the Supreme Court, the debate's not over. And so just don't get too moved by the noise as things move in that direction, because you're going to hear things shifting back and forth all the time. And I'm trying to help you kind of sort through the nonsense and keep the eye on the bigger picture. So just watch where things are going, and we'll see what happens. I'll keep you updated. All right, folks, as always, a pleasure talking with you all. It's always nice. Briefly as well, I'm going to show you a quick trailer at the end of this episode. It's Truth Over News, another channel we have over at Epic Times. They do a lot of the really good reporting on Crossfire Hurricane. If you're wondering what's happening, for example, with Durham and his investigations and the Durham report and so on, and what's really behind all this. Some of the best journalists, I think, around, for example, Jeff Carlson. He is one of the hosts of Truth Over News, and they do some really good reporting and analysis on what's happening. I'll show you a trailer at the end of this video about that. But folks, as always, if you want to support Crossroads, please tell a friend or family member about Epic TV. You can find a link to that in the description below. And folks, that being said, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.
John Durham's indictment of Christopher Steele's primary subsource, Igor Danchenko, has put the final nail in the coffin of the Steele dossier. It has also served to highlight the complicity of corporate media in promoting a false narrative that divided a nation and caused political chaos. The media began by actively promoting the Trump-Russia collusion story that originated with the Clinton campaign. They then directed their focus to Trump policy advisor Carter Page before beginning what would become a prolonged love affair with Steele and his dossier.